Welcome back, guys. This week we're talking about the incest fantasy, so let's all get ready to cringe. Let's take a break from the series on archetypes that I've been doing and talk about the incest fantasy. I did a video on incest a couple weeks ago. Emotional incest, that's how we often see it. Of course, physical incest exists, but how it applies to most people is as emotional incest. And some of the responses I got from that video were they thought that I did a video on incest fantasy. You just saw the word incest and you immediately put fantasy right behind it in your mind, which may say something about you guys who emailed me and thought I was talking about the incest fantasy. I was not talking about the incest fantasy, but this week, let's do it. Let's talk about the incest fantasy. Supposedly it's become more popular on internet porn sites. Why is that? What could possibly be the explanation? Maybe it's just a weird thing that people are getting into, or maybe there is a deeper cause. So let's talk about that. First though, just the idea of fantasy, let's understand what a fantasy is. This is still part of the intro. Let's just understand what a fantasy is. It doesn't represent something that you really want to do. So just because you may have an incest fantasy, just because you violently clear your browsing data, even more violently than you would have cleared it before, because you're looking at whatever stepsister porn, that doesn't mean you actually want to have sex with your stepsister. Just to clear that up, like all fantasies, women have a rape fantasy. Now, does this mean that a woman really wants to be taken forcefully? No, of course not. But that does indicate something about her psychology. That does indicate something about female psychology in general. Men may have a schoolgirl fantasy. Does that really mean they want to have sex with a high schooler? No. But that does indicate something about male psychology. That does inform something about who we are and what we want and what may be causing these fantasies. Similar with the incest fantasy. Doesn't mean you really want to have intimate relations with a sibling or a mom, but it may indicate something about you. So let's get to it. What is the cause of the incest fantasy? Now, barring any cause, like it's just a weird thing that people are getting into, there's no deeper meaning, which granted, that's probably some of the reason why people are watching incest fantasy at a higher rate. But if we're going to make this meaningful, I think another cause could be this quotation from Volume 5, from Jung's Volume 5, Symbols of Transformation. It is a return to the womb. He uses that phrase a lot. Sometimes it's return to the mother room, a re-entering into the womb. It is a way of staying safe. It is a way, in a sense, of avoiding real difficulties. It is a way of avoiding the need to, as Jung would say, as Freud would say to a lesser extent, but he would still say, is putting your libido out into the world, taking your libido, your psychic energy, which was a word that, looking back on it, it's strange to say, but it did confuse me when I was first learning about libido, but I had a professor who cleared it up for me quite well. And he said, just think of libido like money. If you want to know a lot about an organization or a person, what's one good thing to look at? Look at their money, look at what they spend money on. And libido is like psychic money. Where are you directing your psychic energy? I mostly think it's a superfluous term because it's implied in everything. Obviously, as human beings, we have psychic energy. Why have to call it something? But your libido would follow these arrows just to apply it to my emotional diagrams. So you can avoid your libido. You can put it out into the world in a destructive way, or you can put it out into the world in a constructive way. So an incest fantasy would be an unconscious reaction. It would be an unconscious projection of doing this, of just avoiding your emotional issues, avoiding proper engagement with the world, constantly wanting to return to the womb, return to the safety of childhood. That's what really this represents, which Jung thought was helpful in some respects. It could have been And it could still be an important part of therapy, but he wasn't living in our time when people, especially young men, have a difficult time putting their libido out into the world in a constructive way. They want to return to the womb. We stay at home for an extended period of time. We don't leave as much as we do. We don't want to go away for college. We want to stay with our parents. We have an identity closely related with our parents. We have a difficult time being honest with our parents. We may take over our father's business if we don't want to. Not that it's wrong to take over your father's business, but if you don't really want to, and the only reason you do it is because, well, it's the safe thing to do, I don't have to think about my life too much, then that would be an example of returning to the womb. And when you do this enough, you will unconsciously create an incest fantasy, because it's just like, it's just laziness. Let's have sexual relations with somebody within my own tribe, because I don't have to put in the effort of going out and meeting somebody and figuring out where they come from and their background and how our backgrounds are related. That's just a lot of effort. So let's have a fantasy, not that we really want to, of course, to go back to the meaning of fantasies, but let's have a fantasy in which I could just marry a cousin, and then I don't have to put in all that effort. So that would be the cause of the incest fantasy. I don't know. I was just looking at a bunch of videos and they didn't even get into that. But this is from Volume 5, Symbols of Transformation, Carl Jung. He may talk about it. I mean, I know he talks about it a little bit here and there in other writings that he did, but that's, I think, where he mainly talks about it. So what do you do? If you have an incest fantasy, if you find yourself clicking on stepsister porn on Pornhub, well, what do you do? Well, I think the first thing you do is recognize what the cause is and go, oh, there are issues in my life I'm avoiding. I am not, so to speak, putting my libido out into the world in a proper way. I mean, is it any coincidence why this arrow pointing up, the confrontation of anxiety, the assertion of your anger, may represent a certain aroused genitalia? I don't know, but let's do this in a productive way. How do I take the energy that I have? We can call it libido. Again, I think that's mostly superfluous. How do I take this energy and place it out into the world in a productive way? And you will automatically find yourself not having as much incest fantasy. And that's why I think this topic is so important, because, again, this is what a lot of young men seem to be going through. I mean, this is most cases, just young men. They take their emotional issues and they turn away from them. They avoid them. They spend time on the internet. They spend a lot of time on Twitter, and not just incest videos on Pornhub, but lots of distractions, a lot of marijuana smoking. Not that marijuana is bad, but again, if you're using it to distract yourself from emotional issues, video game playing, same thing. We just have a lot of distractions, a lot of turning away, failure to put our libido out in the world in a productive way. And I think the big picture here is, I just think when people come to therapy, and this isn't just a young men thing, I think this isn't a generational thing. I think people have a misconception about what therapy or what psychological growth is supposed to look like in general. When people go to therapy, whether it's analysis, it doesn't matter, they want fewer problems. They want smaller, fewer problems. And I think that's part of the allure of the incest fantasy and turning away from your emotions, is you just want to keep your problems small. So if there's a threat out there, you go, oh, well, I could confront that, but it could cause A, B, and C. I'd have all these problems. And so when people come to therapy, they think, you know what, I just want fewer problems. I want smaller problems, but that's not the goal of therapy. That's not the goal of psychological growth. I mean, in a weird, twisted sort of sense, if you just married your cousin, you would probably have fewer problems. And in a weird, twisted sort of way, you could even get along better, and maybe there would be fewer disagreements, and it'd be more stable. It'd be done within a certain tribal setting. It would just be, in a sense, easier, but that's not psychological growth. When you go to therapy, when you want to grow psychologically, you want more problems. You want bigger problems. Oh, if I start asserting my anger, then people are going to do this and this, and I'm going to have bigger problems. Good. You want big problems. That's the point. That's the point of growing. is you get big problems, but it's okay. You're working on your resources. You're getting more and more comfortable managing your anxiety, managing your anger. So you get big problems and you learn how to manage those big problems. I mean, I can tell you pretty much how successful you are and how happy you are with your life in general if you tell me your biggest problem. If your biggest problem isn't that big of a deal, then I think, well, you're probably not really doing that much. But of course, what happens when you avoid big problems? You still get problems. They may be smaller problems, but they're also weird. You get strange problems. So it's much better to have huge problems than strange problems. And that's it for this week. Thank you for watching. I think we'll get back to the series on archetypes next week. We'll talk about the magician archetype. But until then, like and subscribe, leave a comment, ask me a question, animus@animusempire.com, or just ask a question in the comments. And always remember that when it comes to having an incest fantasy, the ultimate solution is having more problems.